Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Today I'm talking about imaginary record heat. The press has been doing their usual thing this year, claiming record heat in places like Vietnam, India, and now Europe. I've looked at all of these claims, and every single one of them is based on limited data or just outright misinformation. It's hot in parts of Europe right now, and the press is full of their usual hysterical stories. Looking through newspaper archives, you can see very similar stories going back into the 19th century. Hysteria sells, and the press has been doing this for as long as there's been a press. Heat during the summer is not something unusual. There's not a lot of long-term daily temperature data available for Europe, but at least in Paris, the summer of 1947 was hotter than this one. The blue line is June through August 1947 temperatures for Paris. The red line is temperatures so far this year, and the pink line is forecast temperatures for Paris. As you can see, the pattern this year is very similar to 1947, but the peaks in 1947 were higher. Both years there was hot weather both in early June and at the end, but in 1947 the peak temperature was 38 C, which was quite a bit higher than this year. Paris had two more heat waves that summer, reaching 41 C 105 F in July, and another big heat wave in August. Given the similarity of the pattern this year and in 1947, it'll be interesting to see if the same thing happens later in the summer there. Here's a newspaper article from August 18, 1947. After 8 days of shade temperatures running up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit in Paris, France's fourth heat wave of the summer still shows no sign of coming to an end, and the capital is sweltering in a humid heat that is very hard to bear. This last week it was hotter in Paris than in Dakar, and the hot spell apparently holds the record here since 1865. And this is interesting down here. There's indeed a widespread popular belief that the war did actually cause a modification in European climate. People have always imagined that the climate is changing, and they always will. In the 16th century they blamed witches for climate change. In the 1940s they blamed the war, and now they blame greenhouse gases. And here's another article from 1947 showing another thing that never changes. Russia planning to take over the world. Chairman Charles Eaton of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States House of Representatives, in a signed article in August issue of American Magazine, says today, it's clearly evident to anyone who's not mentally blind that Russia is planning to take over the world. Politicians have always known that fear of Russia is a great way to score political points. I married a Soviet refugee, and she was taught exactly the same propaganda about the United States as we were taught about them. But getting back to heat, here's a June 23, 1935 article from the New York Times. 127-degree record heat in Spain. The temperature reached 127 degrees Fahrenheit today, and many persons were prostrated. I would never question the accuracy of the New York Times, so I have to assume that this temperature is correct. There haven't been any temperatures this year reported anywhere near as hot as there were in June 1935. And if we go back even further, we can see that there's been a long history of extremely hot, dry weather in Europe. In the year 627, thousands of people in France and Germany died from thirst. In the year 1000, the rivers of Europe dried up and heaps of fish were left to putrefy and spread the plague that followed. In 1123, the Rhine River dried up in Alsace. During the Battle of Bella in 1260, more men died from heat than from wounds. In 1303 and 1304, the Rhine, the Loire, and the Seine rivers ran dry. In 1779, many persons in Bologna were stifled. Shops all over Europe were closed for months. In 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 persons died from heat in France. All of these spectacular heat waves in Europe occurred at very low CO2 levels, which shows that the increase in greenhouse gases has nothing to do with recent heat waves. Data is very limited in Europe, but in the United States it's not. And we know that heat waves used to be much worse in the United States than they are now. These graphs are from the National Climate Assessment, and they show that heat wave magnitude was much higher in the past, the peak temperature was much higher in the past, and the length of heat waves was also much higher in the past. Let's look specifically at historical temperatures for this date in the United States. This graph shows the percent of U.S. stations over 90 degrees, 95 degrees, and 100 degrees Fahrenheit on June 28th, going back to the year 1895. You can see that the likelihood of hot weather has declined quite sharply since the 1930s, and the five hottest years were 1931, 1933, 1934, 1936, and 1901. This graph shows the hottest June 28th U.S. Midwest temperature going back to the year 1900. On this date in 1901, it was 109 degrees in Wisconsin. That's pretty inconceivable now. You can see from this graph that temperatures over 100 degrees in the Midwest were pretty common on June 28th prior to 1988, but since then they've only happened once in the year 2012. You can also see that the hottest June 28th Midwest temperatures have declined since the early 1900s. Now let's look at how hot it was in the past. This map shows temperatures in the United States on June 28, 1901. The red dots represent temperatures over 90 degrees, and the purple dots represent temperatures over 100 degrees. There were 90-degree temperatures from California to Maine and 100-degree temperatures from California up into Michigan. Imagine the hysteria if we had weather that hot now. It was a similar story in 1931, 1933, 1934, and 1936. Now compare with June 28th last year, which was pretty hot. What we see is a totally different pattern. There's hot weather in the southwest, but the extreme heat of 90 and 100-degree temperatures doesn't spread much into the Midwest or East like it used to. Now let's go back even further to the 19th century. 1896 was an extremely hot year around the world. July 17, 1896, heat wave in Europe, deaths from sunstroke. In Spain, the heat has been so intense that the very birds have been killed. In 1896, the New York Times, who I would never question, reported that Australia had their hottest of hot waves on record, including 127 degrees in the shade at Adelaide. NPR reported that during the summer of 1896, a 10-day heat wave killed 1,500 people in New York City. And Arizona also had their record heat wave in 1896. This graph shows the number of consecutive days over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And in 1896, Parker, Arizona had 7 consecutive days over 120 degrees, a record that was only matched once again in 1905. We've seen from looking at history that the past was very hot and that it has no correlation to greenhouse gases. I reference this 1871 article, Imaginary Changes of Climate, very often because it sums up the same hysteria which we see now. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest, windiest, coldest, or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. Experts always report the most extreme weather on record. They've always been doing it, and the press dutifully amplifies it to make it sound like something horrible is going on. But the fact of the matter is that all of these claims of record heat are due to a poor understanding of history and superstition, and always has been. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.